Well, welcome to the 700 Club. Palestinian leaders are now reveling in their new relationship with the White House. In stark contrast to the policies of former President Trump, President Biden is now promising the Palestinians to, number one, refund the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, reopen a U.S. consulate for Palestinian affairs, and restore funding to the Palestinian Authority.
Well, the administration is also providing $450 million to the Palestinian Authority. So how are the Israelis responding to this? And what could be the long-term repercussions? Chris Mitchell reports from Ramallah.
Palestinian Authority Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh wants the world to know he's satisfied so far with what he's hearing from Washington.
Our relationship with the new American administration has been going very well based on the promises that were made by the Biden administration. We think that this administration is a real departure from where we were with President Trump.
Shtayyeh says those specific promises include restoring funding to UNRWA, maintaining the status quo agreement on the Temple Mount, where only Muslims are allowed to pray, opposing Israeli construction in Judea and Samaria, what's also referred to as the West Bank. The State Department told CBN News in a statement the U.S. does support the status quo agreement on the Temple Mount, opposes unilateral steps that undercut negotiations like settlement construction in the West Bank, and is currently providing $450 million to the Palestinian Authority, some of which is pledged to UNRWA. Perhaps the biggest public nod from the Biden administration came early this year, when Secretary of State Antony Blinken indicated the U.S. would reopen its consulate to the Palestinian Authority in Jerusalem. That promise met stiff resistance from Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. Foreign Minister Yair Lapid suggested the PA use Ramallah as an alternate location. Prime Minister Shtayyeh made it clear that the Palestinian Authority doesn't want the U.S. consulate here in Ramallah, but only in Jerusalem.
Ramallah is not Jerusalem, and Ramallah is not the capital of Palestine. We want this consulate in Jerusalem to be the future American embassy to the state of Palestine.
This conversation brings into question a divided Jerusalem, which Palestinians want as part of a so-called two-state solution. Israeli leaders maintain the city is their capital and will remain unified. Former Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Danny Ayalon, says reopening the U.S. consulate to the Palestinians would jeopardize relations with Israel and endanger the Jewish state's fragile new government.
I think that could really wreak havoc within this government. There's no way politically that Bennett could agree to that. The opposition, which is still headed by Bibi Netanyahu, would have a heyday, and that could spark a large demonstrations.
Ayalon says the consulate dilemma puts the U.S. in an untenable situation, with promises to the PA on the one hand and violating Israeli sovereignty on the other.
Well, Chris Mitchell is with us for more on this. It's a startling change in policy. It looks like the Biden administration has backed itself into a corner of the consulate. Is there any way out for them?
Well, Gordon, it really will be very difficult, and it puts them in the proverbial between a rock and a hard place. Some have put it, they're trying to square the circle. It's going to be very hard. So you have the Palestinian Authority on one hand. They're actually depending on that promise to reestablish the consulate. And as they said, as the Prime Minister said, they really see it as the future embassy for the state of Palestine. It's really reviving their dreams of a state of Palestine. On the other hand, you have this is going to violate Israelis' sovereignty. And Ambassador Ayalon was telling us as well in that interview that it really could cause the Bennett government to collapse if he allows this. And it also, Gordon, it puts Jerusalem back in the middle of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I'm not sure that's where the Biden administration wanted to put it. Demonstrations are already planned to oppose this move here in Jerusalem, and it's really a potentially explosive situation, especially when you're talking about the city of Jerusalem.
It's amazing to me that they would stumble so badly, that they wouldn't recognize the 1963 Geneva Accord on consulates. Israel has an absolute right to decline this. If we press them, we're in violation of international law. I just don't understand how they could make such a blunder.
Well, it's, some people would say they've made a number of blunders right now. I mean, if you look at the pullout of Afghanistan, but actually back in May when Antony Blinken made this promise, Ambassador Aylan was telling us, they didn't really foresee exactly what this would lead to, what problems it would lead to between both the Palestinians and the Israelis. It does seem like an unforced error, but I think when they came in to this administration, they wanted to reverse almost everything the Trump administration wanted to do. They really can't probably move the embassy back from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, but this is something they felt they could do to reopen this consulate. But as we see, it has many ramifications they likely did not anticipate.
Well, they can't move the embassy. That's a violation of U.S. law. They would have to pass a law repealing that. I know a lot of senators would get really upset if they even attempted it. Here's the interesting thing to me, and this is what the Palestinian Prime Minister was talking about yesterday. And he seems to be specifically directing this to the foreign press. He's speaking in English, he's speaking to the foreign press, and he's giving us a different view on a Palestinian state. It's something brand new that I haven't heard from the Palestinians before. Describe that for us.
Well, when you're there in the press conference, Gordon, you're actually listening to a whole different point of view that you hear here in Israel. First of all, he criticized Prime Minister Bennett, that Bennett had 3 no's: no to negotiations, no to meeting with Abbas, and no to a Palestinian state. Now, as he's talking to the foreign press, and if you didn't have any sort of history or about what's going on in the region, Gordon, you really would believe a lot of things he was saying. He was saying Israel's illegally occupying Jerusalem. He's saying all communities in Judea and Samaria are illegal. He was telling Israel is an occupying power, an apartheid state. We asked 2 questions, Gordon. We asked, first of all, about funding Palestinians that are convicted of terror crimes against Israelis. He defended that. He said they had to be responsible. And we also asked him, Gordon, about the death penalty for Palestinians if they sell land to Jews. I think a lot of people may not know that's a Palestinian law. He defended that too and said selling land in Palestine was a political issue, not a real estate issue. And when you have all these views, it's really hard to see a way forward to resolve the situation between Israelis and Palestinians without divine intervention.
Well, I've got to ask, do you think their advocacy now for a 2-state solution? I mean, you go back in the history, they were offered 2 states by the UN in 1948. After the 6-Day War, they were offered a state. They turned it down. There have been various attempts, whether Oslo, Camp David, you name it, they've been offered their own state, and every single time they've turned it down. You listen to the rhetoric coming from Hamas in Gaza, from the Popular Front in the West Bank, and it's all drive Israel into the sea. So do you believe them when they say they really do want a 2-state solution?
It's a great question, Gordon. If you go back to the history, like you said, back to the 1940s, perhaps even before that, they have rejected a 2-state solution again and again and again. And if you look at not only Hamas's rhetoric, but if you look at the rhetoric of Fatah, which is the political arm of the Palestinian Authority, they say quite clearly they see all of Palestine as a future Palestinian state. So if you listen to perhaps the Prime Minister yesterday and you didn't have that history, you would think, well, they do want a 2-state solution. But when you look a little deeper and listen to their rhetoric, what they say in Arabic as well, it looks clearly that they want a 1-state solution, a 1-state to replace the Jewish state.
Is this another classic case where they say one thing in English to the foreign press? They say a completely different thing in Arabic to their own people?
Very much, Gordon. I think that was one of the first lessons I came here over 20 years ago. The head of MEMRI, which is the Middle East Media Research Institute, has said, listen to what is said in Arabic. And if you listen to what's said in Arabic, it's far different than what you hear in English. Yasser Arafat was a master of that, saying one thing in Arabic to his people, another thing in English to the Western press and Western leaders. You got to square that circle. You have to hear what's being said in Arabic to really find out what's happening.
All right, Chris, thanks for the insight. Let me add just a little bit of history to this story, and it goes back to 2016. John Kerry made a speech. He was trying to summarize his policy and the Obama administration policy in Israel. And to give you the broader context, he was also saying there can be no separate peace with the Arab nations without first solving the Palestinian question. So everything that's been accomplished over the last 14 months with the Abraham Accords, with Israel coming to peace with UAE, Bahrain, these nations that have been historical enemies are now at peace. They're now establishing trade with Israel. He was saying that's impossible. We can't do that. So he's already been proven wrong. But here is what he said. And it's fascinating to me to hear Abbas repeat this same thing at the UN, but also their prime minister. They seem to multiply these titles. There's no real government. It's not a state, but they have a prime minister. He's speaking in English, and he's talking about a two-state solution. But they're reading the playbook that John Kerry gave them. So what they're doing is mimicking back the policy that the previous administration had. They're saying, well, we agree with you, and aren't the Israelis really bad? And if you just continue to fund us and continue to do these things, we can have peace. Here's what John Kerry said. They have a choice, and he's talking about Israel. He's talking about the Jews in Israel. They can choose to live together in one state, or they can separate into two states. But here's a fundamental reality. If the choice is one state, Israel can either be Jewish or democratic. It cannot be both, and it won't ever really be at peace. That was John Kerry, December 28, 2016. And that is completely false. Israel is a democratic state. It is a Jewish state. It's a Jewish majority. But they're Arabs in the government. They're Muslims in the government. They have a vibrant democracy. It's the only nation in the Middle East where the Christian population is actually growing. They tolerate all the religions. You have freedom of religion, you have freedom of speech, you have freedom of press, you have the freedom to elect, you have freedom of assembly. You have all these wonderful freedoms. They've been a traditional ally. To put it out there that you cannot be a democracy and hold to the value that the Jewish people have a right of self-determination is absolutely false. And it ignores the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is Palestinians teach their children on a regular basis to kill Jews. Palestinians execute other Palestinians when they sell land to Jews. Palestinians pay terrorists money monthly so that they encourage more attacks against Jews. That's the reality. We finally had an administration that stood up to it, recognized Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel, to stop the payments to UNRWA for all this education of hate, stop the payments to the Palestinian Authority because of the terrorist payments. They finally stood up for what is right. And to see all of that reversed and to proceed down this old path, it really makes no sense to me. So please pay attention to what they say in Arabic, because it's completely different than what they said yesterday in English. Well, today is Veterans Day, and we want to pay special tribute to the members of our armed forces. Sometimes overlooked are the sacrifices their families are making. That's why one Virginia artist created a unique exhibit to honor these hidden heroes. Mark Martin brings us a look at this larger-than-life photo display.
It looks like a supersized class photo spread out on the front of a massive Virginia Beach furniture store. In this case, the home room includes veterans, active duty personnel, and their families across the Hampton Roads area.
I've never produced a public work this large.
Artist Bobby Levin calls his project Expressions of Courage.
I saw this as a perfect vehicle to marry with things that I'm passionate about. A respect for the military, the veterans and the families, and my passion for public art. And that I believe it enriches our lives and makes it for just a better community.
Workers spent 9 to 10 hours installing the exhibit. Levin hopes those who view it reflect on the sacrifice of military families.
There is a shared level of emotion and feelings that every military family goes through, and this just hopefully will raise the level of awareness of that sacrifice that those people are really making, because it's real and it's significant and it needs to be acknowledged and recognized, and hopefully this is the type of tribute that does it.
Every time I look at it, I happen to see somebody else that I recognize.
Laura Baxter is the executive director of the Armed Services YMCA of Hampton Roads. She helped arrange time for Levin to take photos of members of the Y.
He had to make a funny face or, smile. It's not that staunch, I'm in the military, I have to be strong. It's the courage comes in many forms. And when you're talking about the courage that a military family has to entail, they have to have that courage on the front line, but then also the family has to too.
I feel like I'm famous now.
11-year-old Nevaeh Barnes and her mom Ashley James are featured among the 167 photos.
Courage makes you stronger, and it makes you step through your fears.
We may not leave, but we're at home supporting them every step of the way. So it's very, I'm just grateful for the recognition. We feel seen today, so that's really awesome.
Nevaeh's dad, Marquise James, hopes the exhibit sends an important message.
Just the fact that there's more to the military than the service members. It's a network of people working together to get a job done. For the simple fact of me deploying, she has to take care of the household. She has to take care of our daughter. For when I can't help support her, she has to support us.
Altogether, the massive art project is 290 feet wide and 22 feet high. It's part of a global art endeavor known as the Inside Out Project. A French street artist known as JR started that Inside Out project. Through photos on huge canvases, he wants participants worldwide to stand up for what they care about, to turn the world inside out.
I want to give back to my community. I was born and raised here. I was raised less than a mile from the main gate of the naval base in Norfolk. My father was part of the greatest generation and served as a lieutenant commander in the South Pacific during World War II.
Giving back to his community by acknowledging in a very public way the service of those on the front lines and here at home. Mark Martin, CBN News, Virginia Beach.
That is a wonderful story. If you know a military family, please honor their service. The families are serving too. If you have a spouse, if you have a parent, if you have a child in active duty military, well, then you're sacrificing too, particularly the children that, the long deployments, the multiple deployments that we've seen in Afghanistan, Iraq. We need to lift them up. We need to come alongside them and recognize their courage and their service.